Hey, this is Mike. The following is a list of the 5 best and 5 worst creepypastas I've come across on the internet. If you're unsure what a creepypasta is, it's basically a short story made specifically for the internet designed to scare people. They're usually based around technology and have a sort of urban legend vibe to them. There's a few here you might have read, and hopefully a few you haven't. I found myself clicking on the random page button on the Creepypasta wiki quite a lot to try and find the best examples of both really good and really bad writing. For the best creepypastas, I've tried to find ones that are not only scary, but are also well written and creative. As far as the worst go, well, I've spent a lot of time trying to find stories that are truly terrible, but I only want to highlight ones that are unintentionally bad, so there's no troll pastas like A Haunting Most Mario or Star Fox 6664. And I didn't include any that I was on the fence about regarding whether or not they were troll pastas or just really bad ones, such as Banjo's Murder. I have no idea whether that's meant to be as bad as it is. Having said that, though, if I have accidentally included some troll pastas, then I apologise. Also, there's links to each story in the description in case you want to read any. Now, without any more delays, let's get on with it. Number 5 worst. Tales Stole My Story. Tales Stole My Story is about a man who buys a copy of Sonic R for his son. That's the first problem. It tries to make you believe that a child would actually want to play Sonic R. The game turns out to be host to some kind of monster called the Tails Doll, and that's really as far as I can go without spoiling it. The writing is completely atrocious. Entire sentences make no sense, there's no build-up of any kind, nor is there any attempt to establish any kind of atmosphere whatsoever. The only thing it has going for it is it's short enough to remain consistently funny when you try to read it out loud. Here's a clip of me and my friend attempting to do just that. Blood was all over the floor. And, and to this day my feet ache and are sore. It was growling very aggressively. Number 5 best. Russian sleep experiment. This story alleges that Russian scientists in the 40s kept a bunch of political prisoners awake for about 15 days using some kind of experimental stimulant gas. The results of this experiment are bizarre and downright disturbing. I really like the credibility of the setup to this one. It's set in a period of history where things like this really went on, and it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch that a regime like the Soviets might have done something this creepy. The writing style is effective as well. Like, it's informative yet simple use of language. Is kind of cold and detached, as if it was just somebody recounting it for a Wikipedia article, and that works really well. I found myself pretty creeped out by it up until the last few paragraphs, which I don't want to spoil for anyone, but in my opinion, the ending doesn't really live up to the sheer terror of the setup. Number 4 worst. John's Journal. This imaginatively titled yarn is all about a contractor named John who finds the diary of a man also named John in a condemned building. The diary deals with strange videotapes John receives in the post. The author uses repeating motifs and bizarre shifts in time to create a surreal, nightmarish atmosphere where you're not sure which John is which, or at least that's what I'd say if the person who wrote this didn't have the intellectual capacity of a mollusk in a dunce cap. Unlike Tales Doll, the thing is unbearably lengthy, which makes the fact that it's completely inconclusive all the more frustrating. In spite of its somewhat intriguing and original premise, what you end up with is a half-arsed, dull-witted and laughably pretentious story that leaves a bad taste in the mouth. Number 4 best. Happiness for Sale. Unlike most video game related pastas, Happiness for Sale is actually set in the Zelda universe rather than being about a guy who gets a cursed copy of the game. It serves as a haunting and unsettling backstory to the Happy Mask salesman and his shop. The author uses an articulate yet anecdotal style that does a good job of immersing the reader into this frightening world. It's atmospheric and it builds up to a shocking and pretty stomach-churning climax. It's well worth a read, though perhaps not for the weak-stomached. Number 3 worst. So, what's worse than a stupid, boring creepypasta that no one cares about? Give up? How about a stupid, boring creepypasta that everyone loves? Squidward's Suicide has to be one of the most hyped and beloved short stories I have ever read, and in all honesty, I have absolutely no idea why. If you're one of the few people who hasn't read it before, it's all about a weird episode of SpongeBob SquarePants that an intern at Nickelodeon gets to take a look at. The episode is full of crying, hyper-realistic stuff, including hyper-realistic blood, who doesn't love that, and a bunch of photos of dead, mutilated children, which isn't really scary, it's just kind of tasteless and gross. My biggest problem with Squidward's suicide, though, is that there's no rhyme or reason to anything that happens. It's just, oh, look, Squidward's all depressed, dead kids, hyper-realistic blood, and I never saw the episode again. If you're watching this video, then chances are you're a Creepypasta fan and you probably really like this story, and good for you. I'm not trying to disrespect you for having a different taste to me, but I honestly don't see the appeal of this, at all. Cue dislikes and hate comments. Number 3 best, Funnymouth. This is one tense and legitimately frightening tale. Without wanting to give too much away, it's told in the first person and centers around a guy who is on a chat server and encounters some oddball who calls himself Funnymouth. This Funnymouth character starts sending nonsensical emails to the protagonist without having his email address, and soon things start to take a turn for the supernatural and surreal. I really like this story because it's unpredictable and pretty much free of all the repetitious cliches I got so sick of when reading stories for this video. It's one of the few pastas that had me looking over my shoulder afterwards, so kudos to the author for scaring the bejesus out of me. It also has a very clear beginning, middle and end, which makes for a nice change. If you haven't read this one yet, I thoroughly recommend it. Number 2 worst. Conker's Worst Fur Day. Let's get right to the point here. This story is absolutely terrible. Through some convoluted and contrived bullshit involving YouTube, this guy downloads a ROM of Conker's Worst Fur Day and, wouldn't you know it, blood. Lots of blood. But not cartoon blood, oh no, realistic blood. As with a lot of bad creepypastas, there's no build-up, there's no greater meaning to anything that happens, and the author substitutes real scares for buckets of the red stuff. This story particularly pissed me off because it was just incompetent and meaningless. It read like it was written by a show-offy 13-year-old with anger issues trying to be edgy by dumping in as much profanity and gore as possible. As with the others, there's a link in the description, but it's honestly not worth bothering with, so read at your own risk, I guess. Number 2 best. Ben. You probably guessed this would be in here, bearing in mind it's one of the most famous examples of creepypasta around today. But in case you've been living in a sealed concrete bunker 5 miles beneath the surface of Mars, here's a basic synopsis. A college student is left with nothing to do after his best friend buggers off for the week, so he fires up the Nintendo 64 and moseys down to the local yard sale to get a game. He winds up with a copy of Majora's Mask that seems to contain the vengeful spirit of a murdered child named Ben. It's hard to list concisely all the reasons why this story is so damn good, but a lot of it has to do with simply the choice of the game. The author doesn't pick a random, cute, fluffy kids game out of his arse, nor does he resort to choosing a horror game with an already established atmosphere and mythos that additional fanfiction would probably just detract from. Instead, he opts for Majora's Mask, a unique game that many of us played in younger years. While it's not a horror, it frequently had an atmosphere of deep sadness and despair, as well as some nightmarish parts, plus humour and epic adventure. This might sound like a strange comparison, but it's kind of like the gaming equivalent of the TV show Twin Peaks, in that every little detail has some greater meaning, and the whole experience feels like some strange dream you can't quite remember, but can't quite forget either. The author uses this to his advantage by creating a story with a very similar tone, with elements of sadness, fear, paranoia, as well as weird and unexplainable things, perhaps occurring due to sleep deprivation. Another thing that works really well is that there's YouTube videos that demonstrate the glitchy and freakish gameplay that the story describes in agonizing detail. There's also no blood and guts, the horror is much more spooky, and the atmosphere is so intensely thick that you just want to bottle it up and sell it to bodybuilders as a milkshake. This really is a superb example of a gaming creepypasta done right, and if you haven't read it, I strongly urge you to do so. Number 1 worst. There's a lot, and I mean a lot, of bad Sonic the Hedgehog pastas out there. During my time researching for this video, it became very clear to me that the number 1 worst spot would undoubtedly be given to a Sonic story. But which one? In order to scrape the shit barrel as far as possible, I simply had to go back to the one that started the trend. Sonic.exe is without question the worst thing I have ever read. It's about some idiot that gets a PC disc in the mail with a Sonic ROM on it that turns out to be cursed or haunted or some bollocks. Basically, here's what happens. The author sees a shit ton of blood and mutilation and murder while playing through 3 different game scenarios. He gets really scared and sad over pixelated game characters that aren't real, but continues to play anyway and get them all murdered by a Sonic with glowing red eyes, also hyper-realistic blood and 666. The phrase hyper-realistic is used to death and quickly goes from funny to extremely tiresome. It's so repetitious, and worst of all, it never seems to end. I think it might actually be longer than John's journal, but with a lot more bad English and blood thrown in for good measure. And the ending is so unbelievably stupid that it's not a joke, it genuinely gave me a slight headache. If you're a masochist and you're really into pain, then this story might be for you. Or if you're the type of dribbling imbecile who can't tie your own shoes, chews the gum from underneath tables, and thinks PewDiePie is actually talented in some way, then you may get some minor enjoyment from this soul-crushing turd. But for those of you with functioning brains, skip it. Number 1, best. Creepypastas really are the modern equivalent of campfire stories. They're usually told in the first person by any old schmo recounting an urban legend about something recognisable. One thing I always loved about campfire stories as a kid was the way they always seemed to have the horror equivalent of a punchline for the ending. The whole thing would be a setup for some crazy ending that would leave you unable to sleep. With this in mind, I have chosen Cove for my number 1 best creepypasta spot. For those who don't know, Cove is told through a series of forum posts of people reminiscing over an obscure kids show in the 1970s that seems to have almost completely vanished from history. And that's really all I can tell you of the plot without spoiling anything, but it builds and builds to this punchline crescendo, and it left me shaken up. The atmosphere is chilling, and it made all my body hair stand up to the point where I looked like some kind of grotesque porcupine. It's one hell of a short story, and you should definitely check it out. So that was my list. Did you agree or disagree? Don't forget to leave a comment. There's a lot of other great and a lot of other terrible pastas out there, and I may do an honourable mentions video, I may not. See you all soon, and try not to have nightmares.